On our journey together, we've reached an unusual point, perhaps, and a strange one in many respects. Kierkegaard stresses inwardness, but the inwardness he stresses is an inwardness that leads us in one and only one direction if we are to be fulfilled and find the meaning of life. And that direction is toward a full, wholehearted encounter with and relationship with God. But Kierkegaard's God is the Christian God. He has a specifically Christian view, and as a philosopher, he uses reason more than anything to demonstrate to us that at the last step, at the last stage of our development, reason fails us, and it must, because rationally, Christianity doesn't make sense. It helps us in our journey to realize that many philosophers after Kierkegaard were taken up by many of the moving things he said, but they were very skittish about the specific view of religion that he had, the specific Christianity that he held. Let me tell you a story that appeared in a magazine some years ago that's illustrative of the sort of thing that got picked up on through Kierkegaard, but has nothing to do with religion at all. Stories told about a couple who are seen on the beach, and they seem so happy together. And the man writing the story writes it a year later after the woman had died, and the writer of the story comes to a memorial service. And in the article, he celebrates what a wonderful marriage they must have had, though he'd never met them. And what we find out later is they had a horrible marriage, disliked each other intensely. But he couldn't know that. From the outside, it couldn't be known. And Kierkegaard saying we can never know what's really going on in anyone else, we can only concentrate on what is within us, is partly illustrated by that kind of situation. Now, Kierkegaard tells us that if we concentrate on ourselves and discover where we are, we can experience that there are stages we must go through on the way to where he finds the meaning of life. But how then do we get there? It's strange indeed, the path that Kierkegaard propels us on. Kierkegaard claims that the stage of life which all humans start out from, and which few of us ever escape, is what he calls the aesthetic stage. The aesthetic life involves episodes. You don't have continuity in your life, you have discontinuity. You're interested in one thing, then in another thing. You're not really committed and in a sustained way following through on any one course of action. And Kierkegaard says that the way we live most of our lives, in that episodic way where we commit to nothing, actually has underlying it boredom. And that's a great philosophical worry for Kierkegaard. Now, you want and you think that philosophers, especially those talking about the meaning of life, are going to talk about high and mighty things or deep things. Kierkegaard tells us actually where life begins for most of us. The real problem for most of our lives is boredom. And some of us realize that and look for things that will turn us on, episodes that will engage us. Some of us don't even realize that that's the problem in our lives. Perhaps the media world has in some small ways picked up on that. I think you often see when you watch television something called breaking news, and it alerts you to look closely. Well, if Kierkegaard saw that happen, he would say, well, that's because most people are bored. They need excitement. They need something happen. If you say there's breaking news, it gives them something to look at, to experience. But in this aesthetic stage of life, which Kierkegaard tells us about, Kierkegaard claims most of us actually are bored and not even sure whether we will ever escape our boredom. We don't become anybody. because we spend most of our time trying to find things that will interest us, that will get us interested and out of the condition of feeling the blahs. Of course, maybe we have to work hard, but Kierkegaard says when we're not caught up in a life of work, it's probably boredom or not finding anything worth doing that is our dilemma. There's a fascinating play by Henrik Ibsen, the Norwegian playwright. I mentioned it before when we're together. It's Peer Gynt. And there's a scene toward the end of that play where someone that Ibsen calls the button molder shows up as Peer Gynt is nearing the end of his life. And Peer Gynt says, I see you're here. Well, will I be able to go to heaven? And the button molder says, no, you haven't lived a committed life and done and involved in enough good deeds to go to heaven. And the button molder then looks at Peer Gynt and pauses, and Peer Gynt, almost in desperation, says, well, can I at least go to hell? Button molder says, no, that's not an option either. Actually, you just had a kind of episodic life, jumping from this to that. You've not even been bad enough to go to hell. We're just going to have to take you, and I, as the button molder, melt you down as if you were a button and start you all over again. You've been bored, you've taken trips, you've found breaking news, you've done this, you've done that. You've never carried through on anything. You don't amount to anything. You're not even bad enough to go to a bad place. From the aesthetic life and its standpoint, which Kierkegaard thinks most of us don't fully realize we're in, well, what's real is actually defined by whatever captures our interest. And if something new captures our interest, well, then that, for the time being, captures us and focuses us. And Kierkegaard suggests that only through memory, only through imagination, and even the calculated rotation and careful dispensation of pleasures can boredom be temporarily overcome. He says, don't see the same movie too often because you'll get bored with it. Don't eat the same food even if you love it too often, you'll get bored with it. Always do something just long enough that you know you can come back to it later. It will turn you on again. That's what Kierkegaard has in mind as the way the aesthetic life is lived. And he offers despairing passages suggesting a sense that the aesthete finds life futile. There's no integrating passion to live or to die for. It's Kierkegaard's claim that there is a dynamic to the aesthetic life, and the capstone of that is in a famous part of Kierkegaard's writing called The Diary of a Seducer. Kierkegaard tells us that if you're going actually to get beyond an aesthetic life where boredom and episodes are what make you up, if you're actually to get beyond that, if there's a chance of overcoming boredom, you're going to have to be very shrewd and very artful. And he says that the dynamics of aesthetic life really, if it was taken to extreme, would involve, hold your breath, the seduction of another person. Kierkegaard counsels this. He thinks the only way you're going to get beyond the aesthetic life is if you live it to the full. And he claims that if you live the aesthetic life to the full, you will find that playing with the life of another person, seduction, is the best possible way to get out of boredom, to escape enthrallment to boredom. But of course, that's a dangerous thing to do. It's risky. It can be terrifying. Kierkegaard says, do it anyway. The despair and the terror that you will experience in doing that may be the only thing that will get you able to leap out of this aesthetic condition and give you a second stage in which to live. So let's pause a moment to consider this. Is it true Is it true that we are all basically fighting boredom, whether we realize it or not? Could it be true that in everything we do, we seek ways to get turned on, excited, our minds off the ordinary? Could it possibly be true that the best, though it's an extreme way of attempting to conquer boredom, would be by seductive activities? Is it true that those engaged in extreme ways actually would lead us to be terrified? And most importantly, should we take Kirkegaards seriously? Should we engage in that activity? Well, Kierkegaard says yes, because only through living the aesthetic life fully will we ever get beyond it. Kierkegaard offers this account of the aesthetic life in a volume entitled Either Or. And what it's meant to stress is that there are two kinds of life, and a choice has to be made between them. One kind of life, the aesthetic, the other, the ethical. That's the second form of life. And there are problematic and intriguing features to this notion of either or in Kierkegaard. In the book Either Or, the two ways of life are presented by two pseudonymous authors. The one that presents the aesthetic life, who talks about seduction, is called Mr. A. The one who recommends the ethical life is called Judge William. And they're supposed to represent the two different ways of living. Judge William, who's the embodiment of the ethical, writes letters to Mr. A. That's his contribution in Either Or. And in the letters he says, oh, you can have all these seductive pleasures within the stable context of marriage. And in fact, one of Judge William's letters is called On the Aesthetic Validity of Marriage. So is it really either or as Judge William presents it? That's really a problem for Kierkegaard. Kierkegaard has said either you're aesthetic or you're ethical. Judge William says you must be and you can be ethical, but all the so-called joys and pleasures, the excitements of life, can be lived out in the context of the ethical. Oh my. Let's ask ourselves another question. If it would be true that the full and complete living of aesthetic life would lead to a terrifying experience, the experience that we may have done true damage to another person. If you went to that extreme, which Kierkegaard counsels in this writing, could you actually turn back? Could you actually turn back and remain an aesthetic person? Might it be possible that if you took Kierkegaard's counsel to its limit and experienced that extreme situation, it would be unbearable and you would become ethical in any case? Is it also possible that it's not a choice between the excitement of a life of wandering and an ethical marriage, that somehow they can fit together, that fidelity and all kinds of excitements can be in the same package? These are searching questions, questions that absorb Kierkegaard in Either Or. But what is this ethical life? It's not so much for Kierkegaard morality per se, but it's about making the choice to attempt to become yourself, who you really are. The ethical life is a life in which one despairs over who and what one is. One might not know who one is beyond that one wants pleasures. And one might wonder whether one really has a self. But as one turns into the ethical life, one takes as one's task trying to determine whether one has a self and pursuing the becoming of that true self. And Kirkegaard tells us further that if we say our great concern is to uncover, discover, pursue, and become ourselves, we'll discover while doing that we're in despair. We're in despair insofar as we take that as our goal and we see that that goal is problematic and we are not necessarily making good progress along it. There's a doctrine in philosophy. I'm going to refer to it as non-voluntaristic existentialism. And that view is the view that the choice is not over who you are, but over whether you will pursue this self. The question is, granted that there is a somebody that you are, but the problem is to make the decision, are you going to take that journey and find that self and become fully that self? On Kierkegaard's account, if you make that decision, then you're going to control your impulses, and you're going to control them out of a sense of duty and out of a sense that what really matters is the quest for selfhood. And Kierkegaard tells us if you do that, you're working within something that could be called the universally human. You want to find the specific self you are, but you have to do it by acting dutifully. First dutifully, then further the pursuit of the specific self that you are. If we were to believe Kierkegaard, if he's right, then at first you would judge yourself in terms of an ideal conception of who you are. And you would pursue that ideal, saying, that's who I must truly be, and I've got to live up to that ideal. But in a writing of Kierkegaard's called Purity of Heart, Kierkegaard forwards the notion that you must be fully integrated if you're truly to have found yourself. What that means, let's dwell on it for a moment. You might think that you're a certain person, but even if you're able to act and live in the manner of the person you think you are, if that doesn't make you one with yourself, if that doesn't integrate you, then that probably isn't the self that you truly are. And so if there's any at oddsness you have with yourself, any failure of you to be altogether integrated, then even the self that you think you found as your real self, that can't be your real self. And you have to look further. And possibly as you look further, you could reach the point where you think you found now who you really are. But if in living a life in accordance with the person you now think you really are, there is also discordance, elements that don't fit together, discomfort, then that wasn't the real you either. So the pursuit of self continues and continues until you can wholeheartedly be the person that finally you discover that you are. There are 3 stages along the way in the becoming of who you are that Kierkegaard tells us about. One stage, you have a picture of who you are, and what you're finding is that there are some things you do that are out of sync with it, and other things that you should be doing to be in sync with it that you don't do. And that, of course, gives you trouble, but if it's just specific things you're doing or not doing, you think there's a hope that things could get better. However, Kierkegaard said we can easily reach the point in our pursuit of who we are where we discover it isn't just particular things we do or don't do that are the problem. It could be there's something about us beyond particular actions or failures to act that's preventing us from becoming who we are. Kierkegaard says we might work on that. But he tells us that we might reach the point where we see, this is a very strange one, it's who we are that keeps us from becoming who we are. That sounded so mysterious that I'm going to say it again. It's who we are that keeps us from becoming who we are. How can this be? How can this quest for who we are, it keeps failing because on the one hand, we find that at a certain point we can't fit the parts of our life together, and on the other hand, things we do don't add up. How can that quest to become who we are reach a point where we decide the task is that I become who I am? My failure in becoming who I am is a consequence of who I am. How could that possibly be? How can the ethical quest be to be yourself and the discovery be that you yourself keep you from becoming yourself? For Kierkegaard, that is the ultimate crisis within the ethical life. Well, let's continue and think about these things further as Kierkegaard tells us about them. Let's think about whether it's possible. Continue on this line. Is it really possible that it is ourselves we're trying to find and that it's our very selves which keep us from finding ourselves? Kierkegaard thinks that if we do reach the point where we could acknowledge the ultimate failure and impossibility of finding our true selves, if we ever reach that point, then and only then are we ready for something that he calls the leap of faith. Kierkegaard's God, altogether unlike Hegel's, is utterly transcendent of the world. Remember, Hegel's God is a God that unfolds through history. Kierkegaard's God is altogether transcendent of history. And you only reach that God, find the meaning of life, become yourself, if you've tried madly, with no reference to God, to become fully yourself and discover that you've gotten in your way with respect to becoming fully yourself. Kierkegaard's God has little to do with history as we understand it, little to do with culture as we understand it. That God, in relation to whom we would finally find ourselves, is utterly transcendent of these things. And no organization that we might join would help us reach this God. No organization at all would. And this God only speaks to individuals, one at a time. Only one at a time. And if we reflect on this God's nature, we discover that, rationally speaking, it's a contradictory notion. Remember that Kierkegaard is a Christian. Kierkegaard says that God became a human being at a particular moment in time, and in becoming that human being, something that's eternal, something that's perfect, walks this earth. The eternal finds presence in time. And Kierkegaard tells us that if you believe that, if you take that seriously and think about it, you must say that it is an utter contradiction. And he tells us that once you see it's a contradiction, then you must have a leap of faith and embrace it. And if you embrace it after seeing, frankly, that it doesn't add up, that it doesn't make sense, then and only then will you have found the meaning of life. This is religious existentialism, strong religious existentialism. Kierkegaard writes movingly about sustaining this relationship to this God who can only speak to us as individuals and who no other individual could know is speaking to us, nor could we know that this God is speaking to anyone else. This relationship, he says, has to be continually sustained. And he writes moving passages about walking in something called the Deer Park. The Deer Park is in Copenhagen. And in that Deer Park, you walk as anybody else would walk. You see other people. You might even go out of the Deer Park and into an academic environment and listen to professors speak. Or you might read books about the meaning of life. You might even walk and see a church. You might go into that church and see people worshiping. But in the midst of that, what you would fundamentally be doing is not connecting with, not living your life through any of those activities. You will be living your life primarily, if not exclusively, in the inward realization that you are being fulfilled and you have found life's meaning. You found that meaning of life in something that your reason, exercised to its completeness, knows doesn't add up and doesn't make sense. There was an experience that I myself had some years ago that I think illustrates this in a moving way. It was during a religious emphasis week where I was a student many years ago at a religious school. And one of the speakers during religious emphasis week said the following. He said, and his phrase that kept recurring was, "our trembling core." And he ended by saying, and in the evening, when the day is completely over, in the midst of my happy marriage, in the midst of my life with my children, as I turn to fall to sleep, I am reminded that I am alone. I can and must always be alone. And the only real connection I can have toward the meaning of life is my inner belief in God. But the more I think about that inner meaning and that relation to God, the more I'm aware that I can't communicate it. It is not rational. It is something that must be held on by faith alone. We're about now to make a transition. Existential philosophy says we must concentrate on ourselves as individuals. Only our individual lives must really matter to us. And often Kierkegaard is called the father of this existentialism, but as you've seen, there's disturbing aspects to this, because Kierkegaard ties becoming who you really are with becoming a Christian. And as we're going to see, many philosophers think, yes, there is despair. Yes, we are alone. It is altogether the case that there are various stages that are involved in life. It is true that some people live lives that are only episodic and involve boredom, but nonetheless, religion? How could we think that we could become true individuals by reference primarily to religion? And what we're going to see when we go forward is the claim that it's precisely religion that may be getting in the way of our becoming who we truly are. And in fact, the next thinker that we will consider is Friedrich Nietzsche, a philosopher who lives from 1844 until 1900. And the striking remark that Nietzsche makes is that God is dead. And he wants us to believe from that religion finally is an impediment. And it is to the thoughts of Nietzsche, who would also be called an existentialist seeking after the self, that we'll next turn our attention.